This video is about the closing of the Falaise Gap. The formation of the Falaise Gap would be another video. I will go over it briefly. The 25th of July there was Operation Cobra. The Americans broke through the German defences, and by 31st of July, Patton, who'd come in July, 6th of July, he was at Avranches, and then his troops were going into Brittany and along the Loire River eastwards. Now this was a grave situation for the Germans. Hitler saw a solution. He ordered von Kluge, who'd taken over from Rommel, to counterattack towards Avranches. That's on the coast of the Champeaux Peninsula. Now this would cut off the supplies to the Americans and of course give them a big problem. Now this counterattack failed and the Germans were pushed back. Now with the Americans south of them, the British and the Canadians north of them, there was a pocket forming with 100,000 Germans in it. The only thing they had to do now was to try and get out. Operation Totalised brought the Anglo-Canadian forces near Falaise, and the town was finally taken on the 17th of August. The town gave its name to the pocket that was forming. Falaise wasn't really more significant in the battle than other towns, but Montgomery called it the Battle of Falaise Pocket. Bradley called it the Argenton-Falaise Pocket, and Patton called it the Falaise Gap. 100,000 Germans were being trapped in this pocket. Now they were trying to get out. By now the French and the Americans had taken Argenton, which is at the south of the pocket. The Canadians and the Poles were instructed to move to Tournai and Chambois to close the pocket. The Poles had escaped Poland in the invasion, and because they'd fought in so many places in Europe, the Germans called them Sikorski tourists. Now the Canadians had taken Falaise. The Poles, who were working with the Canadians, had advanced further to the east, and some elements of them took Jort, which is where we are, and some others went to Vendôme, further east. Now, because the bridge at Jort was held by the Germans, the Poles crossed the river here by making a fording point, and they later, once they'd taken the town, they built a second bridge here to help the advance. The Poles were commanded by Stanislaw Maczek. It was the 1st Polish Armoured Division. Now they were given their orders to move towards Chambois at 2 a.m. on the 18th of August, and the 2nd Armoured Regiment decided to move out straight away. Now they set out with a guide to lead them to Chambois. You can imagine the difficulty in communicating between the Poles, Canadians and the French. Half an hour after they started out, the French guide disappeared. So they just had to continue without him. Now the road they were following actually went to Champeaux, not Chambois. Their pronunciation of Chambois had probably confused the guide. So they just had to carry on. But the Germans using any road available to get out of the pocket, the Poles came up to a crossroads where German vehicles were crossing at right angles to their direction. This was a big shock. The German military police officer actually stopped the German vehicles to allow the Poles tanks to advance. Kotzuski, who was commanding the column, believed that the German recognised the distinctive silhouette of the Shermans, but he didn't want to get stuck in the middle of a tank battle and got them out of the way. Champeaux was soon reached, but it wasn't until the morning, the daylight, that they realised a mistake. They weren't at Chambois. But coming here did give them a prize that they would have missed if they'd gone the right way. Just near Champeaux they came on a cluster of German vehicles from the 2nd Panzer Division. After decimating the enemy, they found their paybooks indicated they fought many of them 5 years earlier in Poland. Kotzuki now swung his tanks to the southwest towards Chambois, 6 miles away. The Polish units met up at Tournai, which is just over the horizon over there, to the north of us. And from there, Maczuga split up his units. The 1st and 2nd regiments were sent to the north, to the high ground north of Chambois. And the 24th Armoured and the 10th Dragoons came this way towards Chambois, coming through St Lambert, which is just here. The Canadians, already on this high ground, just north of St Lambert, gave them support fire until they were out of sight when they neared Chambois. The Canadian Lake Superior Regiment and the 22nd Armoured Brigade had taken Tournai by the afternoon of the 18th. Major Curry was sent off to capture St Lambert, which is here, with a view to closing the gap. Now at the same time, the Americans had just started to clear up Bourg St Leonard, which was to the south. Now Major Curry approached St Lambert with the tanks leading and the following troops to mop up the resistance. The Germans started firing and launched flares into the sky. The increased visibility led to tanks being hit by anti-tank fire. To make things worse, Spitfires came in to strafe the Canadians. Some kit on Major Curry's tank was set alight and he had to douse the flames. One of the Canadian officers was so enraged that he used the tank's machine gun to fire at the Spitfires. The attack was called off. Major Curry wanted to mount a night attack, using most of the tank crews to add to the infantry, but his commander, Lieutenant Colonel Wotherspoon, told him to wait till daylight. He moved his men up to Hill 117. Here we're on Hill 117, just above St Lambert-sur-Dive. From here the artillery had a good view onto the Germans trying to escape down there in the valley. In the far distance is the Gouffern forest. Bourg St Leonard was over there where the Americans were. And then over this way is Mont or the Mace. That's where the Poles were. During the night, Wotherspoon came from Tournai to join Curry with the regimental HQ. He told Curry to attack at 5 a.m. Curry sent some tanks onto the slopes of the Dives. The main attack went along the main road. Some tanks were knocked out by a Mark IV and a Tiger. Curry was advancing on foot when his own tank knocked out the Mark IV. As the tanks were so vulnerable in the village, it was up to the infantry to clear the town. By 10:40, after fierce fighting, house to house, the town was cleared. Having taken the town, Curry's problems were over. The Americans were at Bourg St Leonard, trying to close the shoulder. Certain German units had permission to open the pocket to allow the men to get out. The Poles and the Canadians were trying to close this pocket, which was full of tens of thousands of Germans frantically trying to get out. There was a sort of panic, but it was controlled in a way. German units would hide in the forests, and then they take it in turns to run the gauntlet of getting out through St Lambert or the ford at Moissy. Curry set Lieutenant Amour's platoon next to the town hall with 3 tanks. They were to cover the approach to the bridge, which is down this way behind me, and also the approach from the west. The remainder of his force was at the northern edge of the village, mostly facing west towards the River Orne. It only had 12 tanks and 50 men. In the afternoon, the 4th Canadian Armoured Division artillery came into range. The Canadians were in a delicate position, but morale was high. Wounded men could be taken out to the field hospital. There was a constant supply of ammunition, and tanks could leave their positions here and go up to the northern end of the town to replenish their ammunition stock. Many Germans were looking for an excuse to surrender. Being faced with stiff opposition was a good enough reason. This famous photo was taken along this street. On the 19th of August, over 2,000 prisoners were taken in St Lambert. This photo might give the impression that the end was nigh, but there was a lot of fighting still to go. During the night of the 19th, the men near the town hall, which is just behind me, they could hear tanks and vehicles crossing the river just a few hundred yards away. This was just a prelude for the final mass breakout on the 20th. 8 a.m. on the 20th, the German breakout began in earnest. Currie's men were engaged in fierce close-quarter battles. It was like trying to stop a horde of ants crossing the garden with your foot. They just swarm over it. At times the Germans were scrambling over the Canadian Shermans to get away. Currie's men pulled back to the centre of the village, then to the northern end. Currie even asked Wotherspoon for permission to retreat further. Wotherspoon refused. At 1500 hours, 8 17-pounder anti-tank guns arrived. They turned the tide. Several armoured vehicles were knocked out, including a Tiger. By late afternoon, the pressure was slackening. Many of the German survivors had escaped to the northwest, and most of the others had surrendered. The Canadians controlled the bridge at St Lambert, which is down there, and the Poles controlled Chambois, which is that way. But this ford was free to use, except it was being fired on. The importance of a ford or bridge is obvious here. The river isn't very wide, but the banks can be 3 foot high. Now men can wade across the river, but vehicles can't. Even a tank would nosedive into the river and jam against the opposite bank. So the only way to get across the river was by a bridge or a ford like this. Now, the problem with a ford like this is it was only a muddy track leading to it, and it was in range of the Canadian artillery on Hill 117. During the night of the 19th of August, things were quite calm and they could get across here easily. On the 20th, when the big rush started, all hell broke loose. They're being fired on, airplanes attacking them. There were 8 vehicles abreast trying to get to this ford, and because they couldn't get across it, they would turn in circles and just turn until they were destroyed anyway. If they did get across the ford, then they had this lane to contend with. This became known as the fatal corridor. The Canadians were this way, firing on them. The Poles were over there, firing on them. Allied aircraft flying around with too many targets to attack. The Allied pilots flying at 3,000 feet, they said they could smell the stench even at that height. The Maczuga sent the 1st and 2nd regiments of the 1st Armoured Division to this high land to the east of Chambois. Chambois is that way. Now the form of this high land reminded Maczuga of a mace, and so he called it the Maczuga, or it looks like Maczuga. Now, in fact, there were 2 hills, both of 263 metres high. This is the northernmost one, and this could interdict movement along the D16, which is over there, and the D242. Now they got here first, and then he sent troops to go to the other 263 hill, and they couldn't get there, so they came back, and this was the main position. Now the tanks that did go towards the hill 263 to the south came up against a German column of vehicles and tanks. They had a plethora of targets, and after half an hour they'd run out of ammunition, So they pulled back and they took some German casualties to the aid station they had, which was just down here at Boisjo. The 2nd Armoured Regiment arrived later with the 9th Infantry Battalion. As with the Canadians, the night of the 19th to the 20th was relatively calm. This was the calm before the storm. The highest ranking officer on the Mace was Lieutenant Sidlowski. He let the commanders of different units decide on their own actions. On the 20th, they were attacked from all sides. There were ad hoc units from inside trying to get out, and Das Reich had been given the mission to break in from the outside to smash open an exit. The first mission of the Germans was to keep the Poles in place so they could escape unhindered. If they could destroy the Poles, that would be an added bonus. Being in a relatively small area, it was easy for the Germans to send in mortars and Nebelwerfers. The Poles also had to contend with German prisoners. They had 800 of them. They were held in an enclosure, in a dip, so they were relatively protected from the battle. At 1400 hours, there was a concerted attack from the outside with infantry and Mark IVs. This was stopped by anti-tank guns. The most dangerous attack came an hour later. The Germans had come up this steep slope further up there, and once they were at the top, they were attacking the Poles on the same level as the Poles. They were aiming at the heart of the Polish position. If the attack was successful, they could roll up the whole Polish position. A Mark IV got right up to the prisoner compound. It was knocked out by a barrel-to-barrel confrontation with a Sherman. During the battle, German and Polish medics were working together to tend the wounded. It wasn't until 1900 hours that the calm was finally restored. The Germans had expended their last effort to get out. During this battle, many of the Poles had run out of ammunition. They were using whatever they had to hand to fight the Germans hand to hand. As well as the great determination of the Polish troops and the weapons they had, they could call on artillery, which was on Hill 113, which is between here and St Lambert. During the day, 7,000 shells were fired onto the Mace. After the battle, 6 barrels of the anti-tank guns had to be changed. The aid station at Boisjo had been attacked by troops supported by tanks, despite the large red crosses. The Polish armour drove off the panzers. Then the infantry, lacking armoured support, pulled out. The padre had been killed, as well as several wounded in an ambulance riddled with bullets. The Poles had run out of ammunition and rations. It wasn't until 11 a.m. on the 21st that the 4th Canadian Armoured Brigade arrived to relieve them. The 90th Division landed on Utah Beach on the evening of the 6th and then the following days. We met them in the video on the Malman line. Now, the 1st Battalion of the 359th Regiment arrived in the area of Bourg St Leonard on the 15th of August. Things were quite quiet then. On the 16th of August, Lieutenant Dame led a patrol into the Gouffern Forest, which is that way, with 7 men. They got into a firefight, and Lieutenant Dame was wounded in the finger, and because he touched his face was covered in blood, and of course the attack plus the sight of his bloody face put the panic into the men, and they hurried back to Bourg St Leonard. Now, that was just the advance guard of a fully ranged attack on Bourg St Leonard. The situation was stabilised by Major Pond. He moved most of the elements of the regiment into the centre of Bourg St Leonard, but that was just temporary, because during the day the village changed hands several times. 1700 hours, the Germans launched an attack to dislodge the Americans from the town. The house that was being used as the regimental CP was overrun by the Germans. There was 5 men upstairs, and even though the Germans threw grenades up and fired through the ceiling with machine guns, the men stayed there, and the Germans called up, "Hands up or I'll kill you." The Americans replied, "Fuck you," and ran out the back and got away. Major Pons once again re-established calm in the town, and then Brigadier General Weaver arrived to tell him that the 2nd Battalion was going to come in to take over, and they were going to launch an attack to the west of the town, which is that way. But that never happened because other events took over. At 5 a.m. on the 17th of August, the Germans tried an old trick. A tank went up the main street, and it stopped now and again, firing back from where it came, as if it was an American tank firing at the Germans. But the Americans weren't fooled by that, and the tank was knocked out. But that was just the start of a fully fledged attack. The fierce battle raged for 3 hours, and once again it was Major Pons who ended it. With 5 Shermans, he went into the town and cleared the Germans out. But of course the Germans counterattacked again, and it wasn't until 11 p.m. that order was finally restored in the town. On the 18th, the Germans had abandoned the idea of trying to get the Bourg St Leonard, and the Americans could now concentrate on firing into the valley where the Germans were trying to escape, at a good advantage point from here. Early afternoon on 19th, the 10th Dragoons and the 24th Armoured Regiment started their attack on Chambois, which is just there. We can just see the keep on the skyline. By early afternoon, they'd captured the north of the town, the other side of the D16. Now the 90th Division were heading here from Bourg St Leonard, which is that way. G Company of the 359th was leading, led by Lieutenant Waters. They came to this church at Fell, from where they could see Chambois. At the edge of the town was Lieutenant Kartz of the 10th Dragoons. He could see a large body of troops walking towards the town, many of them German uniforms. They fired a few warning shots, and looking closer, they realised they were Americans. So they held up a British helmet on the top of a German rifle as a recognition signal. And when Lieutenant Waters arrived, he said, "Nice to see you, buddy." And Lieutenant Katz said, "Rejoice." The streets of Chambois were littered with dozens of tanks and destroyed vehicles, and many of the buildings destroyed as well. With the link-up established, there were still problems. Some German soldiers still trying to get out, and there were thousands of prisoners to deal with. But by the end of 21st of August, the fighting had stopped. Any Germans inside the pocket who were still alive were prisoners. L'Abbé Launay was the priest at Tournai-sur-Dive. He lived in the vicarage, which is next to the church. And just next to the church, there was a farm. And L'Abbé Launay and 37 other people were sheltering in that cellar of the farm for 3 days. And finally, he convinced the German major to put a flag up, a white flag up on the church, because it was time to surrender. And they did that, but because of the smoke from all the shelling, nobody could see it. And so a German Red Cross van turned up, and so the major and Abbé Launay and some other soldiers went off to Tournai to organise a surrender. But when they got to near Tournai, they thought there might be Poles there, and the Poles were the last people they wanted to surrender to. So they went back towards Chambois. And at Chambois they met some Americans, and there was a Canadian there. So the Canadian was brought back to Tournai-sur-Dive, And when the Red Cross van went into the farmyard, 800 German soldiers surrendered to the one Canadian. There are quite a few artifacts in the region. One of them is this half-track at Tournai sur Dive. Another strange artifact is this Mauser barrel stuck in a tree. If you come to the area, the Falaise Pocket, there's this museum here at Mont. Very interesting. Explains the Falaise Pocket, and especially the Poles' activities. It's on top of this ridge here, overlooking the valley that the Germans had to come through to try and get out through this bottleneck. Now down there is St Lambert sur Dive, and just at the end of the ridge there is Chambois. In between them is the ford of Moissy. So the Germans trying to get through there and coming along the death corridor that way. The main Polish position was up on the Mace that way. See this Sherman tank, it says General Maczuga. He was the commander of the 1st Polish Armoured Division. A scout car placed by the museum. There's St Lambert sur Dive in the background. The only tiger in Normandy is this one near Vimoutier. It broke down near Vimoutier. It was in the way on the road, so the Canadians bulldozed it into the ditch, where it stayed for a few decades until it was put here on show. The thousands of vehicles that were destroyed in the funnel of the Falaise Gap took 15 years to clear away.